Here at RUSI, we speak to around 8,500 students who are in professional military education every year. 18 staff colleges around the world in everything from a single lecture to a 2-week long work package. And on themes as diverse as Great Pack Competition, the future of alliances, or hybrid warfare, active measures, the deep battle, or the reality of contemporary conflict. We have a special relationship with Ecole de Guerre. In Paris, the students don't have a deeply intensive laid out syllabus which they've got to crack through during that year. They do that work before they get to the college. And as a result, the year they spend in Paris, they look at topics which are designed to exercise their intellect, to extend their idea of concepts of doctrine, to change how they think about great problems. We've been privileged to, over the past 3 years, to set them a series of challenges every year, and in conjunction with the English department there, the students spend their year looking at a selection of topics that we give them and deciding to write a dissertation thesis on one of those topics. The topics we select aren't necessarily those that are around the big issues of the day. They're not even necessarily over the big issues over the next 2 to 3 years. But they are issues and challenges that we think need looking at. They're issues that might extend to 20 or 30 years out. They're conceptual and they're designed to stretch them intellectually, to bring something else to bear as they go into the next parts of their careers. Now, normally, at the culmination of their presentations, at the end of their academic year, the students present their findings and their paper to a panel who then challenge them, question them, and generally dig into some of the detail that sits behind it to really push them and challenge some of the debating skills. And again, they do this in English. What's even better is that we found that we have the support of both Vice Chiefs of Defence Staff from the UK and France who make their way to London to RUSI and join these sessions, each of which has been fascinating, challenging and insightful. This year, of course, that wasn't possible. It wasn't possible for the students to come to London to present or to bring people into a big room to do the challenge sessions. So we did it virtually. And we weren't able to bring a whole variety of others to come and view what they saw. So instead, we did it virtually. And the attached presentations that you can see in the following clips are the findings of the students and their papers. The students are really to be congratulated for what they have delivered. It's quite astounding not only that they've achieved this in a year, but in a second language and delivered a paper as well as a compelling and good presentation at the end of it. The whole range of topics that we gave them for the last year were everything from the reliance on logistics, proxies in space, the morphing of cyber and space challenges, contested theatre entry. But perhaps the two most interesting presentations that you'll see were on, firstly, the concept of parity in military terms, and secondly, the changing rules of warfare and what they mean for the future. The students of both of these presentations really excelled themselves, and we're really grateful to the support from Rob Johnson at CCW and numerous others who helped them through what is a difficult intellectual period for them. We really enjoyed working with them and hope you enjoy the presentations that follow. Thanks very much for watching. The first research question that we sent the students was a broad theme around: has the contractorization of defence gone too far? In explaining this to the students, we used the example of logistics. Military logistics, interestingly, since the pandemic in many countries has been lauded as a great capability, but in reality now is certainly not up to the speed of development of some of its commercial rivals. DHL, Amazon, Hermes, all the other large companies that specialise in from strategic supply to the final mile delivery to the door and integration with the customer have operated in a very different way and have adapted far faster than the military, which in many cases is still using a biro, a pencil, paper, a rubber, or perhaps an Excel spreadsheet. It's interesting that also organisationally, in the face of efficiency, some nations have gone to joint logistics. this idea that individual services can abrogate responsibility for logistics delivery to a central provider. Such a central provider uses rotational people out of each command to fulfill its needs and ensure that priorities are given where they are. But the underlying problem with such organisations is that their responsibility is abrogated to a central organisation where people generally don't have any ownership for the problem beyond the 3 years of their tour. It is something that is worth looking at across the wider picture of contractorisation of defence. Since 1996, governments and militaries have increasingly employed contractors for supply and logistics support. The rise of dedicated service providers for military deployments has reduced costs for militaries, making the use of commercial entities increasingly attractive in the face of financial austerity. From 2003, for a variety of reasons, states have started using private military contractors in tasks from force protection, embassy, FP, and deniable operations. There are a few signs this trend is reversing. Indeed, it seems to be a core part of any military mission planning that now envisages a role for private military companies. For some states, these roles have become essential as military expertise in those areas has been deleted under austerity or cutbacks. Yet commercial providers and private military companies operate under a profit mandate, not one that prioritises the mission or the outcomes. These organisations also have a more limited risk appetite than regular military units. Recompense for services for them is often in proportion to the risk the units face. This might have been satisfactory in an area of counter-terrorism or counterinsurgency, but as states refocus on great power competition and high-intensity conflict, there are signs that the contractorisation of defence has perhaps gone too far. The three groups of students who tackled this topic came at it in very different ways. One looked at NATO's POL supply chain and efficiencies that may be made there in a short-termist policy recommendation. A second group looked at a far more ambitious view of whether Europe should develop its own large federalised private military contractor. And finally, the third group looked at outsourcing as a trend. They're all very interesting presentations, but the one on the EU federalised capability is certainly the one that demonstrates the most intellectual curiosity and conceptual interest.
So, ladies and gentlemen, I'm Major Gardet and this is Major Outil. We are here today to present you our analysis about the contractorization of POL support in a context of high-intensity conflict. Since the mid-1990s, operations have been expeditionary and against super adversaries. The lack of symmetric components has allowed for the rise of contracted service providers for military deployments. However, if we take the case of high-intensity conflicts, contractorization creates some vulnerabilities. To limit our analysis, we have decided to address only the petroleum, oil, and lubricants support to defense. Our focus, therefore, is on the French Military Fuel Service, SEL, its British counterpart, the Defense Strategic Fuel Agency, DSFA, and of course, the NATO fuel support. As part of this focus, we analyze the current and the future use of contractorization for POL support in a case of a NATO coalition. Looking at the French, the British, and NATO doctrines, we will identify and examine internal and external factors affecting past defense decisions to increase the use of contractorization for POL support. We'll conclude finally by providing some recommendations to optimize the use of contractorization in preparation for high-intensity conflicts. In order to understand why governments outsource fuel support, it's interesting to study why the private sector has made this choice. The use of outsourcing is based on increasing profitability through a significant reduction in cost without resorting to associated investments. Like private sector entities, armed forces contract and outsource for many reasons, including to focus on core competencies and operational objectives, to reduce cost, to gain flexibility, and to access expertise and efficiencies from specialist providers. NATO, in order to conduct its daily operations, uses a wide range of forms of contractorization. NATO does this to address capability gaps in strategic and defense commitments, but there are many other reasons: financial incentive, diplomatic reasons, and political reasons. In summary, these advantages support an ever-increasing use of outsourcing. However, one should not overlook disadvantages presented just after. They are not always well evaluated by armies. A wrong decision in contractorization may impact the operational capabilities and quality of the service, and or may cause legal, managerial, and financial troubles. Risks and additional costs inherent in outsourcing are numerous. The first and probably the main risk is the loss of control over the quality and cost of contracting function. Second, the loss of key capabilities within the armed forces. Third, the lack of planning and preparation by the contracting party. Fourth, the security risk for deployed troops. Fifth, there are risks regarding the sustainability of the adequacy of the service provided and the service anticipated by military forces. Sixth, the sensitivity of data transfer abroad may also be assessed. And seventh, a final risk concerns the viability of such a model. To conclude this part, outsourcing represents a great opportunity, but caution should be exercised especially to maintain capabilities to deal with high-intensity conflict. With regard specifically to the outsourcing of POL support, it's interesting to focus now on different strategies operated by the French and British armies and more generally by NATO. Flavien, it's your turn.
Good morning, everyone. This is the second part, and I would like to show you that our models of outsourcing are peacetime models. So I will present you the French model, the British model, and the NATO policy regarding the field support. So regarding the French model, that is an efficient model, but already under pressure, even if we are in peacetime. It is a compromise between a joint military service, the SCA, and a limited outsourcing policy. Since 2010, SCA has increased the proportion of transport outsourced in France in order to save resources. In overseas operations, when possible, SCA outsources all storage and transport in order to have the maximum military resources available for the front of the battle. Actually, this is a model which is inadequate for a high-intensity conflict without further outsourcing or more resources. SCA has not enough flexibility in terms of human and material resources in the event of a high-intensity conflict. In consequence, without more means, outsourcing will be the only credible solution in the short term. The risk is that French armies appear too dependent on the private sector to deal quickly with major conflicts. Concerning the British model, this is a peacetime model in search of efficiency to be more resilient. This model responds to economic needs and is based on the perception that the private sector is more responsive, flexible, and able to deliver efficient services at a lower cost. The private sector is organized around this culture and knows how to work together with the British MOD in order to achieve a viable model. This is a solution that is economically rational and logistically suitable in peacetime. With Anthony, we have seen during our researches some very interesting innovative examples of outsourcing in UK. But there is a risk, the risk that the dispersion of support and the dependence of the private sector could be fatal in the event of high-intensity conflicts. Finally, regarding the NATO policy, for NATO, until 2 years ago, the field support was an outsourceable national responsibility, so it was a national program for NATO. Furthermore, it's not eligible for burden sharing. The only thing that NATO proposed by the past was to get contracts with the NATO NSPA, the NATO Support and Procurement Agency. But recently, NATO was aware of the limits of the current situation. Actually, NATO cannot ask the allies, on the one hand, readiness and enablement, and in the other hand, consider that it's a national responsibility. That's why NATO recently convinced of the need to measure the impact of the outsourcing and to avoid total dependence on the civilian sector. NATO is now asking a review of its fuel support assets. In this last part, we will propose recommendation to NATO countries. The first recommendation is to maximize the fuel support strategy within NATO. How? By developing a fuel storage capacity policy. By forcing or proposing the NATO member states to be prepared to use the single fuel policy in case of high intensity conflicts. It will allow to simplify the fuel supply chain and to save resources. By developing smart defense with the MCPC capacities between NATO countries. MCPC is a modular concept with a mix of the NATO assets for only one mission. And to limiting and organizing fuel outsourcing. So that's our first recommendation. Our second recommendation is to develop partnerships with the fuel sector, identifying all local companies and international pool of companies with technical expertise, evaluating the capacity of the private companies to increase their production and the distribution process, and testing the requisition procedures. And our last recommendation is to optimize NATO member states' resilience by increasing their military reserve. So NATO has to optimize the use of reserve, but if we do a focus on the French forces, maybe France could have a reflection about a French fuel military specialist reserve. And we think also that France has to develop the sponsor reserve in their contracts, in its contracts, sorry.
To conclude, since the second industrial revolutions, fuel has been a key resource for the world economy. For armies, whose dependence on fuel has grown steadily since the Second World War, the supply of fuel has become increasingly important. Until now, armies have been accustomed to contractorize the supply of POL support. However, in the case of high-intensity conflicts, with likely high rates of casualties, civilian companies may no longer be willing to fulfill their commitments. That is why some countries, such as France, the United Kingdom, and the USA, and some international organizations, such as NATO, have initiated studies to develop a new doctrine. In order to work, solutions proposed in this paper need a real support from the private fuel sector and real will to cooperate between allies. Additionally, the public and governments need to acknowledge that peace dividends have been reaped and that it's time to prepare for an uncertain future where increasing tension will arise over the possession of ever more limited natural resources. In that respect, this paper recommends strengthening partnerships with suppliers because they are key to strategic success, increasing NATO capacity, expertise, and common concepts in order to be more efficient, more resilient, and less dependent on the private sector, and developing a military reserve within certain NATO member states to be able to manage the increased fuel needs of high-intensity conflicts. That's over, sir. Thank you very much.